Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. Suzanne Richerson was a talented and generous woman. Not only was she an extraordinary community volunteer, Suzanne was an accomplished musician, a freelance writer, an avid reader, lover of gardening, world traveler, wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. Many organizations were the beneficiaries of her time and her energy. Over the years, she gave countless hours to the Iowa City Public Library. She served on the board for nearly a decade and in various other capacities. As a singer, she performed with a variety of groups, including the Camerata Singers and the Chamber Singers of Iowa City. Her love of art was shared with the young when she volunteered as the picture lady for elementary students, encouraged them in art appreciation. Suzanne volunteered at the University Museum of Art, was a member of the League of Women Voters and 19th Century Club. In addition to her scholarly pursuits, she loved the outdoors, cross-country skiing, scuba diving, walking and hiking. She and her husband Hal made a trip to the mountains of Poland in 1992 to aid in fieldwork studying wolves with Earthwatch. Suzanne Bradley was born in 1934 in Carbondale, Illinois. Her parents moved to Denison, Iowa, and then Tucson, Arizona. Suzanne graduated from Tucson High School, attended the University of Arizona for 2 years before marrying Hal Richerson. They lived in many places in the United States before coming to Iowa City in 1961. She received her bachelor's degree in music and a master's degree in English from the University of Iowa. Another of Suzanne's talents was her love of cooking. In 1994, she lovingly put together a cookbook called Family Meals and Memories. In the introduction of this special cookbook, Suzanne writes, and I quote, "This book is not about formal dinners. It's about cooking and sharing family meals. We revel in the joy of good food we share. Our family loves to cook and to taste what we've prepared, and often after eating, we sit telling stories or arguing vigorously about current events or laughing about times we've shared over the years. We have drawn our own thread about our rituals of eating and talking together." End quote. Her 4 daughters, daughter-in-law, mother, mother-in-law, all contributed recipes. Suzanne died on April 18th, 1996. And the most important aspect of her life, however, was her family. She is survived by her husband Hal, a son George, 4 daughters, Anne, Miriam, Julia, and Susan, and 9 grandchildren. This video show, One of a Kind, is a tribute to Suzanne Richerson. 4 women today have gathered to share the connections and the stories about her. Let me introduce the participants. Lolly Eggers, the retired director of the public library, had a long and deep connection with Suzanne, both personally and professionally. Suzanne was a true friend of the public library, and I'm going to let Lolly tell you about all the connections. Carol Christensen, a well-known musician, was also a longtime friend of Suzanne's. The two shared their vocal talent as members of the Camerata Singers and Chamber Singers. Carol, along with Suzanne, were charter members of the Chamber Singers. Naomi Shadle, retired head of the Fiber Art Division of the School of Home Economics and of the University of Iowa, and a well-known mixed media artist, was another friend of Suzanne's. Naomi and Suzanne belonged to a book club together, shared a love of art museums and galleries, and along with Carol, enjoyed gardens and gardening. And my association began with our connection to the public library and 19th Century Club. And in 1992, Suzanne became my research assistant First for Tell Me a Story, and then for One of a Kind. I'm going to start our conversation today, Carol, with you. I know you know a little bit about Suzanne's early childhood and a little bit about her father and mother's influence.
Well, Suzanne was the daughter of a radio announcer, and I've heard his voice described as being very musical. I never did have the opportunity to hear him speak, but she always reminisced about the sound of her father's voice as he read stories to her, he read poetry to her, and he also sang to her. Mm-hmm. I think that she and her father used to sing duets when she was a little girl. One of her daughters told me that Suzanne's younger sister had a sense that her dad kind of favored Suzanne. He thought that she was the very talented one, and that he would show her off to friends when people came over, and he encouraged her to be a performer.
How did you two meet? How did you and Suzanne meet?
Suzanne and I met, I think it was in 1961, when she and Hal came from Arizona, moved to Iowa City, and we had been alerted that someone from the Southwest was coming, and we had just been living in New Mexico for 2 years, and so we were eager to get together with the Richersons and to talk about our love of the desert country. And we also knew that she was a musician, so that was going to be a common thread. And we loved Mexican food, and we began our friendship by sharing a lot of meals with a lot of hot Mexican cooking.
How did you meet Naomi?
Well, I went to a party on Court Street. Is that where Suzanne lived? I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And there was a woman there who was wearing a really beautiful colored pieced quilted skirt. And that was how I met Suzanne. And I later found out that her mother had made the skirt for her. I know that Suzanne had a number of her quilts, and so do all her children. And I think that Suzanne's love of fiber art and the visual arts comes from her mother.
Didn't you go to galleries a lot together?
We did go to galleries together. Actually, our husbands would go to a professional meeting in Chicago in the fall, and Suzanne and I would go to the museums and galleries together. I remember one time we were looking at a very long and large Rauschenberg painting, and we discussed how it was made, and we decided that he had taken a tire and used that to print his design.
Oh, Lolly, how did you meet Suzanne?
I have a very special memory of that day, too. Suzanne moved in across the street, and so she came to my door, this handsome young woman, to borrow a cup of sugar or something after she moved in, and I didn't know anything about her. And just a couple weeks later, our youngest children, at that time George was her youngest child, and my youngest son went off to kindergarten on the same day. And we ended up on my front porch getting acquainted. And we found that we had all these things in common. We spent the whole morning. In those days, you didn't have to accompany your kindergartner to school. It was safe to walk up the street a few blocks. And we talked books and ideas and movies all morning, and knew after those couple hours that we had a real friendship going. And so for the next few years with our children in school, and before she had what we used to call her second family, her 3 daughters, we had a lot of time together and went to movies and did a lot of things together that were kind of self-indulgent, things that we maybe hadn't had the time to do. And as couples, we started going to movies and theaters. But the one thing that we did that maybe gave something back to the community, interestingly enough, was connected to the library in the early 60s, and that is that we took training for junior great books, as discussion leaders, and we led a junior great books discussion in the bottom basement of the old Carnegie Library. And I think that our the afternoons we spent preparing for that, in which we had to say what are the basic questions that we can ask to get these children to understand and talk about what they've read. Opened a whole new doors of ideas and so forth, and I can remember sitting in her living room with the Navajo rug, and they were pretty exotic to me, a Midwesterner all my life, getting ready for those discussions.
That's such a thread, the book.
Yes, because Suzanne and I belonged to an informal book group. It was so informal that some of us would argue about books we hadn't read. But Suzanne and I found that we had similar tastes, and so we have a long history of being interested in writing and so on. And I remember when she was getting her master's degree in English, that she would describe the courses she was taking and discuss her papers with me. And I think that was the reason why, you know, knowing she was interested in fiber art and knowing of her writing skills, I asked her to review some exhibitions for the magazine
when she first
Fiber
did that.
Arts and the New Examiner, Art Examiner. She also did publicity work for the museum. I think that was a job. Yeah.
We belonged to a book club together
Yeah.
for a long time.
But yours was
and
probably a formal one.
It was.
Read the
No
book.
argument.
But we, for example, of the wide kinds of things, we spent a whole year reading Japanese novelists, I remember, and that was sort of
We read
a stretch into
Virginia
a new-
Woolf.
And you know that you told me before the interview that she kept track of books for her grandchildren. Is that
Yes,
right?
I think that's an amazing accomplishment. After she began using a computer, I think it was a little bit easier than it would have been writing longhand, but she was so eager to provide a complete library for each of her grandchildren that she paid very close attention to what they each one owned so that she could add any important books that were missing. So with 9 grandchildren, that was quite an accomplishment.
Yes, the time involved. Carol, tell me about your connect with the music and her love of music. Was that her first love? Is that her first degree was music and then her second degree was English?
Suzanne had started in journalism at the University of Arizona, but then, as you mentioned, was married and had children right away. So by the time she got to Iowa City, I think she'd kind of caught her breath, and she had focused on doing a bachelor's degree in music at that point. And I remember that I would babysit for Suzanne. She had, I guess, her 3rd child at that point, Miriam, and I had a little boy who was just a month younger than Miriam. And the two would play together at my house oftentimes while Suzanne went to school. And she finished off that bachelor's degree very efficiently, and we were singing duets at that time. Suzanne was a soprano, and I was an alto. And we used to practice our duets after she'd come back to pick up her child, and I can remember the children in the playpen crying because they were so jealous that we weren't paying any attention to them.
I remember her senior recital when she got her
Oh, yes. Wonderful memories.
holding her hand beforehand. She said, I can't do it, I can't do it. And of course she did fine.
I have another wonderful memory of singing with Suzanne, if I can insert this. I remember that we sang a duet from the Bach Great Mass at the First Presbyterian Church one Sunday morning. And for some reason, we each had to take our baby to church with us. I guess we didn't have anybody to babysit for us. And we decided that it would be efficient and probably safe if we would sit down and nurse those babies just before we went out to sing the duet, the Christe Eleison. So we did. I can just see us sitting in the nursery, each holding a baby, nursing the babies, and then we went out
And performed.
and sang at the service.
It's a wonderful story.
So, Lolly, you really hooked Suzanne into the library, or was that her lead?
No, I don't think I did. I think it was just a coincidence that such good friends ended up working together at the public library. When she was getting her other degrees, I was off at graduate school getting my library degree and started working at the library. And in 1971, she was appointed to the library board. But for a few years before that, she, under the flag of the League of Women Voters, she was an observer at library board meetings. And that may have been how she showed her interest and was appointed. And she served on the library board for 10 years. And after I became director in 1975, we were heavy into planning for the current library building. And so she had a great deal to do with that. We took a trip once to Chicago, which of course she knew well because she used to live there. We found out we were perfect traveling partners because I could drive the freeways fine or the highway to get there, but when I got to Chicago I was absolutely frightened, so she took over. And we spent 3 days visiting libraries in the suburbs of Chicago, and many of the ideas that we brought back there are in the building today. Also, there's a thing that happened there that kind of is characteristic of Suzanne, I think. We had a city car because it was official city business. And one morning when we came out of the motel, it wouldn't start. And I don't like cars anyway. And I thought, oh dear, what are we going to do? And it worked out fine. But Suzanne's ability just to sit back and say, oh, well, you know what happened, and what can we do while we wait, and let's find out something interesting. I mean, she was always so calm and so forth. That it always was wonderful. She served the library for 10 years, longer than most anyone. She saw that building through as an active board member. And her attention to the library never flagged a bit after that. I mean, she was... She worked on the campaign, of course, but she also worked on a long-range planning committee, and she worked on our levy campaign in 1991. She served on the art advisory board, picking original art for the library. And one thing she did that she has absolutely no credit for and should be told is that the library's endowment fund, which is now a considerable amount, started with our attempt to get an NEH, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And I had the idea for the grant, and I sort of knew what I kind of wanted to say, but I wasn't very good at saying it. And she worked day in and day out with me, helping me to write that document. And there was no way that I think that we would have been awarded that grant if she hadn't, forced me to really articulate what it was that we wanted to say, and then her ability to edit and take my writing and turn it into something that was a lot classier than I was able to do by myself. And I really do think she has a lot of credit, and that was the basis for the whole endowment fund at the library.
Let's talk about her writing. That was another one of her talents. She was a wonderful writer.
I believe that she wrote some grants for the Chamber.
Oh, yes, she did.
Didn't she? Yes.
She had an amazing amount of energy for a kind of job that most of us would rather not be involved in. Mm-hmm. And she was quite successful for a while, getting money from the Iowa Arts Council, and I think ultimately from the National Endowment for the Arts for chamber singers.
She was helping you with your history.
I retired in 1994 and said casually once, I'd kind of like to write a history of the library. It's never been done, and our centennial is coming up, but I don't know how serious I was. But she was right there with her enthusiasm and her encouragement, and she says, oh yes, do it, I'll help you. I'll help you with the research, which she did, and I'll edit, and she edited the first 2 chapters, and I learned just a little bit of what she knew about writing and editing, and it gave me the confidence that I can get through this. And of course, I'm determined now to finish it, if only to honor her work on it. But she was a good writer, and she had the ability to teach too. We'd spend mornings in her dining room going over the manuscript, and I just learned a lot because she was able to share her understanding and her insight and her rich vocabulary and a lot of things that really helped me get started.
And I think she was really interested in a lively cultural atmosphere, and I think many of the things she did contributed to that in Iowa City. I know that personally she loved going to plays, and we, husbands and the 2 of us, would go to plays in Chicago, to the small theaters there. We would go to the Riverside Theater, and University Theatre. And I always remember those long lists. She was an avid moviegoer, and those long lists of movies that were made into videos that she'd distribute to.
And she gave a lot of movies to the library. She decided the library should have this very fine film. She'd go out and buy it and give it to us. She spent many hundreds of dollars buying books, and primarily movies for the library. She was a good patron.
And didn't she and Hal belong to the Lyric Opera in Chicago for many years?
Yes, they would go into Chicago 4 times a year to listen to operas.
They not only belonged to the Lyric, but they also were members of the Art Institute of Chicago also.
You talked to one of her daughters beforehand that she kept a journal for quite a few years of her life.
I don't know whether Suzanne started journaling at the time you were reading Virginia Woolf, but I know that she was quite touched by Virginia Woolf's writings, and I think that intensified her journaling at that point. Her daughters agreed that they thought possibly the journaling was a way that Suzanne worked through things that she needed to think about deeply. She didn't have to talk things over with people always. She could just write about what she was feeling, what she was currently thinking, and then she would come back and check that over and maybe revise it. And that's a very good psychological process, certainly. I know that she took a course on the essay from Karl Klaus. This was sometime after she had received her master's degree in English, but she was, as you all know, continually learning. And she began writing her own essays enthusiastically. Unfortunately, she was not completely satisfied with the way most of that work had turned out, and I was eager to read what she had written, and she wasn't ready to share it. But I believe that Hal has taken most of that material from her computer, and so maybe the time is coming
to hear that,
when we'll be able to read her essays.
I think she was very diffident about her writing, which she shouldn't have been.
I think so too.
Yeah, she was very private, and Hal hadn't read many of the things, as you said. I remember he told me a story that she misplaced her journal on their Australian trip, left it in the airport, and all of her writings for those days there, and how upset she was that was gone.
Another aspect of Suzanne was her love of the outdoors. And
yes, she really enjoyed the ambience of her garden. And as a matter of fact, I introduced her son-in-law, Mike Lang, to her. He had created a pool in the bottom of our garden, and he and Suzanne would plant things, dig things out, put them somewhere else, rearrange the garden. I remember that I tried to convince her. She didn't like yellow, and I tried to convince her that yellow flowers looked very well with blue and mauve flowers. She finally bought a very pale yellow foxglove. It was almost white. I think we were both amused by that.
And you shared that gardening interest also, didn't you, with her?
Yes, I believe I got Suzanne started raising hostas. I had a couple of varieties which always needed to be divided, as hostas often do, and I passed those on to her. And if you go to the garden that she created, you will see how through the years she and Mike, whom you just mentioned, have created a lovely ground cover that covers the entire north side of their yard, and I believe the west side also. And it seemed to me that after the Richersons lived in London, and that must have been in
84?
Was that the year? She had been visiting private gardens and public gardens the year she was in England, and I think she really caught fire. She became very enthusiastic then about expressing herself artistically with plant materials.
Yes. And what was the name of the woman who designed Suzanne's garden? She had something to do with my garden,
Was
too.
it Laura Verdon?
Laura Verdon, yes.
Yes, she's now at Planter's Palette outside of Chicago.
She is, yes. Well, Suzanne and I would go to various landscaping places and look at flowers. We'd go to the Project Green sales and buy hostas too. So, and also I remember that she and I came out to your house and looked at the hostas and the tiny little blue flowers, the phlox. They were so beautiful.
The out of doors for her also extended to physical things, did it not?
Yes, yes. We went hiking together. We would take Chelsea, her dog, for long walks and talks. I think you probably did that too. And we would go skiing together. One time, Hal and Suzanne and my husband and I went skiing. It was very cold. The temperature was about 10 below. And we had a Malamute, and the Malamute came with us. The Malamute somehow got involved with a pony that was there and kept on running round and round. And I think eventually we couldn't get him to leave with us. And so eventually we all went home together. And as Hal and Suzanne would always remember the time we tried to entice our dog back into our car.
But not just hiking, she's scuba dived.
Scuba dived too, yes.
And went to some pretty wonderful places scuba diving. The Great Barrier Reef.
In Australia.
Yeah, in Australia, and they went to the Cayman Islands. Where else did they go?
I wish that I can say that I had been a part of those trips.
I think Suzanne was always very nervous about it when she started, but once she got under the water, she really enjoyed looking at the fish and the beauty of the underseas.
Now, all three of you, I know, have eaten in the past at Suzanne's house, and you mentioned the love of Mexican food and this cookbook that we've all have a copy of was such a wonderful gift to her family and her friends, with memories from her growing up and then the growing up of her children.
I remember that she made homemade tamales in probably the first 10 years after she came to Iowa City. It's a tremendous amount of work to make homemade tamales. The making takes more than a day's time. You use roast beef, and then you shred it, and you take the masa, the cornmeal, and create the filling, or the shell for the tamale. I can remember several occasions feeling very lucky to have been invited to have a lovely meal on her screened-in porch, which really centered around the tamales. And since she and Hal had both lived in Tucson, Arizona, most of their growing up years, it was like a way for them to go back to their origins. And they would put a lot of care into the way the table was set and the music that was playing during these meals that centered around Mexican food. I have wonderful memories of those times.
She loved to cook, and I always enjoyed eating there. And however, not being much of a cook myself, it was always a wonderful experience. But back to the cookbook, I was so thrilled to get it, because not only is it a wonderful collection of family recipes, there are these delightful comments that she put in that come from her children, and they represent the family life of the Richersons, which was always very special to me. They were, in many ways, this model family that I loved to watch, and at weddings and anniversaries, and then we spent time with them in London when Hal was on sabbatical there. And they just were a family that the care and love for each other just showed all over. And I was so taken with some of the comments, and this comes out in every way in the book, Family Meals and Memories, and that's the part I treasure about it.
It was as if the meal time was almost a ritual. It was a family ritual time to have that sense.
And of course, Anne, her oldest daughter, did some catering for quite a long time, and
She's a wonderful
she's
cook
a very
herself.
good cook. Yes. When I look at use Suzanne's cookbook, I tend to use Suzanne's recipes rather and Anne's.
One of the parts I remember about that book that I thought, this is why her children liked to cook, is she was willing and able just to let her children come in the kitchen and do whatever they wanted. And I think I thought of my mother, who usually didn't want to get things messed up or said it was easier to do it without, and some of that's the difference between why they're all cooks and I'm not, because she saw that, and
It's a good lesson.
she taught them to love to cook and love to eat, and it shows.
Well, my association with Suzanne started when she volunteered to be a research assistant for my series of Tell Me Your Story and One of a Kind. And we've mentioned what a wonderful, wonderful writer she was. And she would always be so thorough and just would so enjoy getting to meet each one of these guests and finding out more about the story. And she even gave me some suggestions of some of the guests. And always she would have a cover letter, and it would be her impressions of this guest, but there was always something about Suzanne in it. And I want to just share a few. They're very short, but they'll tell you a little bit about Suzanne's story. First one was Charlie Ebel, and this was the cover letter to the interview. Throughout his years, Suzanne writes, as the only music source for Iowa City, Charlie has been supportive of all the music programs. He gave generously to chamber singers as well as to other local groups. While I waited for Charlie to verify dates, I browsed another aspect of his life, his love of literature as reflected in the books on his bookshelves. Charlie was a pleasure to interview for his connections with Jaime and the history of the School of Music, and also his long-term friendship with local practicing artists. And then this was Rosalie Braverman, a well-known Iowa City, longtime Iowa Cityan. She wrote, Rosalie's memories of her childhood in Poland resonated with images similar to those that my own mother has related to me. Of course, her Jewish heritage and my own Catholic background make for obvious differences. Still, her struggles are similar to those endured by many early 20th century Eastern Europeans. She feels and expresses a keen sense of history, and this reveals itself rather poignantly in what is left unsaid in the story she gave me to read. She is another one of those amazing people who have lived through very difficult times, and once more I enjoyed the experience of the interview. And there's one of Sally Lindbergh. We sat on, well, some people know her as Sarah. We sat on Sarah's front porch with its decoratively painted floor, and while the acorns tumbled onto the roofs of the neighborhood, she told me about her life. For years she had been Sally to me. We regularly swam at the city park pool, grumbling at the crowds, at too few lap lanes, etc. She's a pleasant, even-tempered person with a wise, community-centered vision. I enjoyed visiting with her and getting to know more about her, and look forward to the finished video. Yes, those were wonderful insights, and I thank you all for sharing your connections, Carol, and Lolly, and Naomi, about Suzanne. Suzanne Richerson was a multi-talented, multifaceted woman who never made a show of her many gifts. She went about doing the things that interested her with dedication, intelligence, and a wonderful humility. Iowa City was enhanced by Suzanne's contributions, and we, and so many others, have been enriched by her life. E.B. White could have been writing about Suzanne when he described the talented spider in the children's classic, Charlotte's Web. I quote, "She was in a class by herself. It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. Suzanne was both." Suzanne Richerson was one of a kind.